My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I was known by roles that sounded smaller than they felt: wife, caretaker, the reliable one behind the scenes. I lived in a comfortable suburb where appearances mattered, where people believed stability was proof of happiness, and where no one ever asked too many questions if things looked orderly from the outside. People often assumed they understood me very quickly. I didn't interrupt, I didn't raise my voice. I listened more than I spoke. That led many to believe I was passive, maybe even dependent. Some mistook my calm for submission. Others assumed that because I didn't complain, I must have been content. I learned early that when you make life easier for others, they rarely stop to wonder what it costs you. I was seen as dependable, useful, replaceable, though no one would have used that word out loud. This story is not about a dramatic collapse or a sudden rebellion. There are no screaming arguments, no public scenes, no moment where I stood up and shocked everyone with a perfectly timed speech. What happened was quieter than that, so quiet that for a long time, no one noticed it was happening at all. This is the story of how my husband treated me like a servant, not in ways that were obvious or easy to point to, but through expectations that slowly hardened into rules, through assumptions that my time was flexible, my needs negotiable, and my presence guaranteed. It was never framed as cruelty. It was framed as practicality, as tradition, as that's just how things are. And for years, I accepted that explanation. I want to be clear from the beginning. This is not a story fueled by revenge. I'm not here to embarrass anyone or rewrite the past to make myself look flawless. I made compromises. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I benefited from the comfort of the life I was helping maintain. Those truths matter, and I won't deny them. What this story is about is awareness, and what happens when awareness quietly changes the balance of power. It's about realizing that silence can be mistaken for obedience, and how that misunderstanding can become leverage. It's about learning the systems that govern your life: financial, legal, emotional, better than the people who assume they control them. Yes, money plays a role in this story, but there are no sudden windfalls, no miracles, no dramatic strokes of luck. Just patience, observation, and decisions made carefully, long before anyone thought they mattered. This is a story about timing, not triumph, about restraint, not rage. I'm telling this now because I know how easy it is to doubt yourself when your discomfort has no clear name, when nothing looks wrong enough to justify leaving, speaking up, or being taken seriously, when everyone else seems comfortable with a version of you that feels smaller than who you really are. If you've ever felt invisible while being indispensable, if you've ever wondered whether your quiet endurance was being mistaken for consent, this story may feel familiar. I'm not asking you to take sides, I'm inviting you to listen. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever noticed how differently people treat you when they believe you'll never stop being useful to them? For a long time, I was not introduced by my name. I was introduced by my function. She keeps everything together. She's so good at managing things. I don't know how we'd function without her. They said these things warmly, even proudly. And I smiled when they did, because on the surface, they sounded like compliments, but none of them described who I was. They described what I provided. In our family, I was the background system, the one who knew where everything was, when everything was due, and how everything worked. I remembered the quiet preferences people never voiced out loud. I anticipated conflicts before they surfaced and dissolved them privately so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. I learned to read moods the way some people read weather, instinctively, constantly, without comment. My husband never explicitly told me this was my role. That's the part people misunderstand. There was no announcement, no agreement. The role formed gradually, shaped by repetition, by what happened when I stepped in and what happened when I didn't. When I handled something, it was expected next time. When I didn't, it was noticed. At first, I told myself this was a partnership, that I was contributing in my own way. My husband worked long hours, made visible decisions, and carried the title everyone respected. I handled what didn't have a title: schedules, family obligations, emotional maintenance, continuity. The invisible work that keeps life from unraveling. I didn't resent it in the beginning. I was proud of being capable, of being trusted, of being the one who could handle it. That word, handle, followed me everywhere. Evelyn will handle it. Just ask Evelyn. She's better at those details. No one asked if I wanted to. Over time, my presence became procedural. I was included where usefulness was required, excluded where authority was exercised. Conversations about decisions happened around me, not with me. Plans were made assuming my availability, my flexibility, and my silence. And because I didn't protest, because I adjusted smoothly, everyone assumed this arrangement was mutual. At family gatherings, I was moving while others were seated, refilling glasses, clearing plates, remembering preferences. When I finally sat down, the conversation had already shifted to topics I wasn't part of. Investments, opportunities, decisions already half made. If I spoke, it was usually to clarify a detail, rarely to offer an opinion. No one told me to be quiet. They just didn't pause for me. The strange thing is, invisibility doesn't feel like neglect at first. It feels like efficiency, like harmony, like being low maintenance. You convince yourself that not needing much is a virtue, that asking for more would be disruptive, ungrateful. I told myself stories to make it make sense. This is just how families divide labor. He's under pressure, I'm helping. This phase will pass. But phases only pass when something interrupts them. And nothing was interrupting mine. My husband trusted me completely, with tasks, with responsibility, with execution. But trust without respect is a subtle thing. He trusted me to carry weight, not to question direction. He relied on me, but he didn't defer to me. There's a difference, and I didn't have language for it yet. What I did have was consistency. I was always calm, always composed, always reasonable. I never raised concerns in a way that made others uncomfortable. I chose my words carefully, softened them instinctively. If something bothered me, I framed it as a misunderstanding. If I felt overlooked, I dismissed it internally before anyone else could. From the outside, I looked secure, privileged even. A woman with a stable marriage, a comfortable life, and no visible conflict. People assumed silence meant satisfaction. They didn't see the slow narrowing of my role. They didn't see how my world had become smaller without anyone explicitly shrinking it. And I didn't see it clearly either, not yet. At that stage, I still believed that being indispensable meant being valued, that reliability would eventually earn reciprocity. If I kept things running smoothly, someone would notice the cost. That was who I was to them then. Not a partner, not a decision maker, not a problem. Just the constant. And constants, I would later learn, are the easiest things to take for granted. The first time I noticed it, I almost dismissed it. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a raised voice. It was a moment so small that if I tried to explain it later, it would have sounded petty. That's why it stayed with me. Because the things that hurt the most quietly are the ones you're told not to take seriously. We were at a dinner with friends, people who had known us for years. The kind of evening where conversation drifts easily, where everyone relaxes into familiar roles. At some point, the topic turned to finances, investments, long-term planning, and the usual polite exchange of confidence and numbers. One of the friends turned to my husband and asked, half-jokingly, "So who actually handles all of that in your house?" Before I could answer, before anyone even looked at me, my husband smiled and said, "Oh, that stuff just gets taken care of. I don't have to think about it." Just gets taken care of. The table laughed softly. The conversation moved on. No one meant harm. No one noticed anything wrong. Except me. It wasn't that he didn't credit me by name. It was the way my work disappeared into the air, transformed from effort into inevitability, as if systems simply maintained themselves, as if order was the natural state of things, not something actively sustained. I felt something tighten, then release, a reflex I'd practiced for years. I told myself it didn't matter. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I mentioned it casually, not as an accusation, more as an observation. I said something like, I actually do handle most of that. He didn't turn around. He was already distracted, already moving on to the next thought. "Well, yeah," he said. "That's what I meant." That was it. No acknowledgement, no pause, no curiosity about how it landed. And again, I told myself it was nothing. But once you notice the first small cut, you start noticing the others. They didn't arrive all at once. They arrived spaced out, almost politely. A comment about how flexible my schedule was, said as justification for why my plans could always be adjusted. A decision was made without consulting me, followed by, "I assumed you'd be fine with it." Praise delivered in a way that sounded more like relief than appreciation. None of it rose to the level of confrontation. That's what made it dangerous. At a family event, someone asked my opinion about something that directly affected our household. Before I could respond, my husband answered for me. Not dismissively, confidently, as if he were helping. I smiled. Of course I did. Later, I replayed it in my mind, searching for intention. Was he aware he'd done it? Was it a habit? Did it matter if it wasn't malicious? I didn't yet have the courage to admit the real discomfort. It wasn't about what he said. It was about how natural it felt to him to speak over me, and how natural it felt to everyone else to accept it. The hardest part about subtle disrespect is that it offers you plausible deniability. You can always explain it away. You can always tell yourself you're being sensitive, and because you want peace, because you've built your identity around being reasonable, you do exactly that. I kept track, though, not deliberately, not like a ledger, more like a faint awareness that something had shifted, that the ground under my feet wasn't as solid as I'd assumed. I didn't confront him. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't demand anything. Outwardly, nothing changed at all. But inwardly, a question had formed, a quiet one, an inconvenient one. If my presence could be overlooked this easily, if my contributions could be erased without comment, what exactly was my position here? I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in a way that demanded tears. I was alert. And that, I would later realize, was the beginning of everything. Once you accept the first explanation, the rest become easier. That's how normalization works. Not through force, but through familiarity. After that dinner, moments like it continued to appear. Never identical, always slightly different, as if carefully varied to avoid pattern recognition. A comment here, an assumption there. Each one is small enough to excuse, reasonable enough to overlook. And I did overlook them, repeatedly. When my husband discussed plans that affected both of us without consulting me first, I told myself he was just thinking out loud. When he framed my time as endlessly adjustable, I reminded myself that flexibility was one of my strengths. When decisions were already in motion by the time I heard about them, I convinced myself I trusted his judgment. Trust, after all, was supposed to be a good thing. The problem was that trust began to function in only one direction. I trusted him to decide. He trusted me to adapt. That imbalance didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, disguised as efficiency, as leadership, as someone taking charge I wouldn't have to worry. And because I rarely challenged it, it solidified. At social gatherings, my role became predictable. I was the stabilizer, the translator of moods, the one who smoothed transitions and filled gaps. If someone needed something, they came to me. Not because I had authority, but because I was accessible. Accessibility is often mistaken for willingness. If I ever tried to redirect a conversation towards something I cared about, it rarely gained traction. Not because people were rude, but because they weren't accustomed to hearing me take up space. I had trained them well. Sometimes my husband would praise me in public. He'd say things like, "I couldn't do what I do without her," or "She handles everything." People smiled. I smiled too. But the praise felt oddly hollow, like applause for backstage work, necessary but not worthy of attention. It reinforced the same message: I was essential but not central. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when a comment lingered too long, or a decision cut too close to something I cared about. Each time I ran through the same internal checklist. Is this worth the discomfort? Will this create tension? Am I overreacting? I rarely liked the answers, so I stayed quiet. I adjusted. I compensated. I told myself I was choosing peace, that silence was maturity. That is not everything that needs to be addressed. What I didn't realize then was that I was teaching everyone, including myself, how to treat me. The most dangerous part of normalization is how logical it sounds. I had explanations for everything. He's under a lot of pressure. He doesn't mean it that way. This is just a phase. Other people have it worse. Each explanation reduced the urgency of my discomfort. Each one has a delayed action. And over time, the absence of resistance began to look like consent. My husband stopped checking in. Not out of malice, but because nothing in his experience suggested he needed to. The system worked. I made sure it did. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who assume you're fine. Because if you ever try to articulate what's wrong, you have to dismantle the version of yourself they're comfortable with first. I wasn't ready to do that, so I minimized myself instead. I stopped volunteering opinions unless asked. I framed preferences as suggestions. I chose words that softened impact, even when clarity would have served me better. I told myself I was being strategic. But strategy without direction is just endurance. The truth, one I wasn't yet ready to face, was that I was afraid. Not of him exactly, but of what acknowledging the pattern would require of me, of the disruption it would cause, of the possibility that I might have to choose myself over stability. It was easier to adapt than to confront, and so the disrespect, subtle as it was, became familiar, predictable, almost invisible. Until one day I realized something unsettling. I could no longer remember the last time I'd been asked what I wanted, without already knowing the answer wouldn't change anything. That realization didn't explode, it settled, and once it did, I couldn't unfeel it. The clarity didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, assembling itself slowly until the picture was impossible to ignore. I began to see that I wasn't just behaving a certain way. I was being positioned. And I had participated in that positioning by being consistently reliable, consistently accommodating, consistently quiet. In our family, my role had become fixed. I was the one who remembered, the one who adjusted, the one who absorbed the inconvenience so others wouldn't have to. If something went wrong, it somehow traced back to me, not through blame, but through expectation. If a detail was missed, it was surprising, almost unsettling, because it contradicted the role I'd been assigned. Reliability had become my identity. And identities once assigned are hard to escape. I noticed how conversations unfolded differently depending on who was speaking. When my husband voiced an opinion, it was considered a position. When I did, it was treated as input, optional, flexible, easily overridden. Not because he dismissed me outright, but because the structure already existed. He was the decision maker. I was the support system. I had become useful in a way that required me to remain unseen. What startled me wasn't that others accepted this dynamic. It was how normal it felt to them. As if this arrangement made sense. As if it were natural that one person carried authority and another carried continuity. I asked myself when I'd agreed to this. There was no moment, no contract, just repetition. Every time I smoothed something over instead of naming it. Every time I adapted instead of pushing back. Every time I told myself it wasn't worth addressing. The role solidified quietly. At family gatherings, people would look to me when something needed to be done, and to my husband when something needed to be decided. No one questioned this division, neither did I, at least not out loud. There's a particular kind of erasure that happens when competence becomes expected. Your effort disappears into the outcome. The smoother things run, the less visible you are. I had made life very smooth. And in doing so, I had made myself easy to overlook. What hurt wasn't the work itself. I didn't mind contributing. I minded the assumption that my contribution was automatic, infinite, and unquestionable. That assumption showed up in small ways. In plans made without my input, in schedules that assumed my availability, in conversations that framed my role as background support rather than shared leadership. No one asked if I wanted more. They assumed I didn't. And the most uncomfortable realization of all was this. They weren't entirely wrong. Not because I didn't deserve more, but because I hadn't required it. I had confused being needed with being valued. I had mistaken reliance for respect. And in doing so, I had helped build a version of myself that was indispensable but not empowered. That version of me was safe, predictable, non-threatening. It didn't challenge anyone else's position. The problem with roles like that is that they don't collapse on their own. They persist until something disrupts them, until the person occupying them changes. At that point in my life, I hadn't changed yet, but I had begun to see, and seeing changes everything. Once you recognize the shape of the box you're in, you can no longer pretend the walls aren't there, even if you don't touch them yet, even if you don't plan to leave. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce my realization. I didn't demand a renegotiation. I did something quieter. I stopped assuming the role was permanent. That thought alone barely formed, barely acknowledged, created a small internal shift. Not enough to disrupt the system, but enough to loosen its grip on me. The day everything shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no revelation delivered in a dramatic sentence. It was an ordinary weekday, structured and predictable, the kind of day that blended easily into the rest of my life. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table in the late afternoon. The house was quiet in that temporary way. Between responsibilities, between people coming and going, I had a stack of mail in front of me, mostly routine, bills, notices, statements. The kind of paperwork I had handled for years without thinking too much about it. I opened each envelope automatically, my hands moving ahead of my thoughts. At some point, I realized I was no longer skimming. I was reading. One document held my attention longer than it should have. Not because it was shocking, but because it was clarifying. It outlined arrangements, responsibilities, and access. Language I'd seen before, but never with this particular awareness. I noticed how many systems in our lives run through me, not symbolically, practically. Accounts I managed, records I maintained, details I tracked that no one else fully understood, because no one else needed to. Everything worked, so there were no questions. And in that quiet moment, something in me finally clicked into place. If I stopped, things wouldn't collapse immediately, but they would stall. Not dramatically, inconveniently. I wasn't powerless, I was positioned. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. I sat there longer than necessary, the paper resting on the table, my hands folded loosely in front of me. I wasn't planning, I wasn't strategizing. I was simply allowing a truth I'd avoided to settle. I had been living as though my value came from my willingness to carry weight without recognition. But weight is still weight, no matter how quietly you bear it. For the first time, I considered what would happen if I chose differently. Not impulsively, not emotionally, just deliberately. What if my silence wasn't an obligation? What if it were a choice? That question changed the temperature of everything. Up until then, my quietness had been reactive, a response to circumstances, a way of maintaining stability. But sitting there alone, I realized it could also be intentional, strategic, not to punish anyone, not to prove anything, just to see myself clearly. I didn't act on the thought right away. I finished sorting the mail. I made dinner. I followed the familiar rhythm of the evening. My husband came home and talked about his day. I listened. I nodded. Nothing seemed different. But I was different. I was no longer assuming permanence. I was no longer telling myself this was the only configuration possible. That internal shift didn't announce itself. It didn't change my tone or my behavior immediately. It simply created distance, just enough for observation. From that day on, I paid closer attention, not with resentment, but with curiosity. I noticed who relied on what, who asked questions, and who never did. I noticed how often my presence was assumed, and how rarely it was acknowledged. And I stopped filling in gaps automatically. Not enough to raise alarms, just enough to notice what happened when I didn't. The system didn't break, but it did reveal itself. That was the moment I stopped seeing myself as trapped by circumstances and started seeing myself as someone standing at the center of them. No one else knew this shift had occurred. That was important, because real change doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with clarity. Once awareness settled in, my silence changed character. Before, it had been automatic, an instinct shaped by habit and self-preservation. Now, it was deliberate. I wasn't withdrawing. I was observing. And there is a difference between the two that most people never notice. I didn't announce any change. I didn't alter my routines in obvious ways. I continued to show up, to manage, to keep things running. From the outside, nothing had shifted. But internally, I had stopped filling in the blanks without noticing them. When my husband spoke about plans, I listened without immediately aligning myself. When someone assumed my availability, I paused before agreeing. When a decision was made without consulting me, I noted it quietly. This wasn't passive resistance, it was data collection. I wanted to understand the system I was part of before I considered changing it. I wanted to see how much of it depended on my silent cooperation. The answer slowly became clear. People mistook my composure for compliance. They always had. But now I understood how deeply that assumption ran. Because I didn't object, they believed I agreed. Because I didn't assert, they believed there was nothing to assert. My silence created comfort, and comfort breeds carelessness. My husband, in particular, relaxed into the arrangement. He trusted that I would manage whatever needed managing, that if something required attention, I would handle it, or alert him. He didn't feel the need to check in because historically, nothing had required his intervention. The system had trained him well. What surprised me was how quickly my intentional restraint went unnoticed. I stopped reminding him of small deadlines. I delayed offering solutions until asked. I let minor inconveniences surface instead of absorbing them preemptively. Nothing catastrophic happened, but small frictions appeared. Brief confusion, missed details, moments of mild irritation that didn't have an obvious source. I watched how people responded, who felt entitled to solutions, who felt inconvenienced by their absence. No one looked at me. That told me everything I needed to know. I was expected to fix things, not to be factored into them. And as long as I continued to do so quietly, the pattern would persist. My silence was no longer about keeping the peace. It was about seeing clearly. I began to understand something subtle, but powerful. When people believe you are predictable, they stop preparing for your absence. They stop questioning their assumptions. They build their confidence on your consistency. That confidence becomes fragile when tested. I wasn't testing it yet. I was simply noting its shape. There's a misconception that power always announces itself, that it needs to be visible, assertive, and loud. In reality, the most durable forms of power are embedded, structural. They function best when no one is paying attention to them. I had been embedded, and now I was aware of it. This awareness didn't make me superior. It made me responsible. I knew that any change I initiated would ripple outward. I didn't want chaos. I wanted alignment. So I continued quietly. I documented mentally. I noticed patterns. I listened more than I spoke, but this time with intention. And because I didn't demand anything because I didn't express dissatisfaction, people assumed I had none. That assumption would later cost them. But at this stage, it simply gave me room. Room to think, room to learn, room to prepare. Silence, when chosen, becomes a tool. And like any tool, its effectiveness depends on timing. I was not ready to act yet, but I was no longer waiting without awareness. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while they assumed nothing had changed. Because when you are invisible, you are also uninterrupted. No one questioned why I asked more detailed questions than before. They assumed I was being thorough, the way I always had been. No one wondered why I lingered longer over documents, why I reread clauses, why I started keeping copies of things I'd previously just processed and filed away. They trusted the system, and I was the system. I began by organizing, not outwardly, but internally. I created mental categories for everything, what I controlled directly, what I influenced indirectly, and what merely passed through my hands. I noticed how many processes relied on continuity rather than authority, how much depended not on signatures, but on timing, familiarity, and follow-through. I learned where decisions were recorded and where they were merely assumed. I paid attention to language, the difference between authorized and customary, between required and expected. These distinctions mattered more than anyone realized, because they determined who truly held leverage when circumstances shifted. I didn't rush. Rushing would have been suspicious. Instead, I asked questions that sounded like maintenance, clarification, housekeeping. I framed curiosity as responsibility. And because that matched the role everyone already believed I occupied, no one resisted. If anything, they were relieved. Thank you for handling this. Glad you're on top of it. I don't know how you keep track of all this. I smiled. I took notes. I started documenting, not in a way that would alarm anyone, but in a way that created continuity outside of my head. Dates, patterns, dependencies. Not to accuse, but to understand. Understanding is power's quiet foundation. I noticed how often my husband deferred details to me without realizing it. He assumed knowledge flowed upward when, in reality, it pooled around me. He had authority, yes, but authority without context is fragile. I didn't resent him for that. I simply acknowledged it. What surprised me most was how little resistance I encountered. Systems are rarely guarded when they're working smoothly. People protect what they believe is threatened. They neglect what they believe is stable. I was considered stable, so I learned. I learned how money moved before it became visible, how decisions were finalized long before they were announced, how much of control was actually habit reinforced by confidence. I learned the difference between what was legally binding and what was socially enforced. And I learned how often the latter was mistaken for the former. This wasn't about plotting, it was about fluency. I wanted to be fluent in the structure of my own life. There were moments when I wondered if I was going too far, if observation itself was a form of betrayal. But then I reminded myself I wasn't hiding anything new. I was simply paying attention to what already existed. No one had ever discouraged me from understanding. They had simply never expected me to. The more I learned, the calmer I became. Anxiety thrives on uncertainty. Clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, is grounding. I stopped fantasizing about confrontation, about being seen suddenly, dramatically. Those thoughts lost their appeal. Visibility, I realized, was not the same as influence. Influence comes from positioning, and position is built quietly, over time. I adjusted nothing yet. I didn't withdraw support or demand acknowledgement. I continued to operate as expected, but I did so with full awareness of the structure I was sustaining. That awareness changed how I saw myself. I was no longer a passive participant in a dynamic I didn't choose. I was an informed actor in a system that had grown comfortable relying on me. And comfort, when unexamined, creates vulnerability. They never noticed the shift because it didn't inconvenience them. It didn't challenge their assumptions. It didn't ask them to see me differently. That would come later. For now, I was still invisible. But I was no longer unprepared. The reveal didn't feel like a victory. There was no rush of adrenaline, no satisfaction, no urge to tell anyone what I'd uncovered. What I felt instead was a deep, quiet stillness, the kind that arrives when a long-standing question finally answers itself. I was reviewing documents late one evening, not because anything was urgent, but because I developed a habit of understanding things fully before setting them aside. What I noticed wasn't a single explosive detail. It was a convergence. Several small facts align at once. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. I saw how much continuity depended on my presence. Not emotionally, structurally. I saw how authority had been assumed, not reinforced. How access had been granted by default, not by intention. How oversight was scattered because trust had replaced verification. And most importantly, I saw how easily that trust could become exposure. This wasn't about wrongdoing. There were no secrets in the dramatic sense, no hidden accounts or illegal arrangements. What existed was something far more common and far more fragile: complacency. Over time, decisions had been layered on top of assumptions. Responsibilities had been delegated without documentation. Access had been extended without clear succession. Systems had grown around habits rather than safeguards. And I was the habit. I sat there for a long time, not moving, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally understood the scale of my position. Not the role I'd been given, but the one I actually occupied. If I stepped back suddenly, things wouldn't explode. They would stall, delay, complicate. The kind of disruption that doesn't look dramatic but quietly erodes confidence. And confidence, I'd learned, was the real currency in our household. I didn't feel tempted to use this knowledge immediately. In fact, the absence of urgency was reassuring. It meant I wasn't acting from emotion, I wasn't reacting. I was simply aware. There's a moment when power becomes real. Not when you use it, but when you realize you don't have to. I closed the folder. I didn't mark anything. I didn't take copies I didn't already have. I didn't change passwords or lock doors. I just sat with the truth. I had leverage. Not because I'd taken anything, but because I understood everything. That understanding shifted something fundamental in me. For the first time, I didn't feel small inside the system I'd been maintaining. I felt proportionate to it. I wasn't above it, I wasn't below it, I was central. And that meant I had responsibility. Power without restraint is reckless. Power without clarity is dangerous. I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want to prove a point. I wanted alignment between how things worked and how I was treated. But alignment requires choice, and choice requires resolve. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because anything had changed outwardly, but because I was no longer confused about my own position. Confusion had been the real burden, not workload, not silence. Uncertainty. The next day, everything continued as usual. My husband went to work. Conversations followed familiar paths. Requests were made with the same casual assumption. I responded as I always had. But now I was responding from a place of clarity, not obligation. I knew what was possible. And knowing that made all the difference. Once you understand your position clearly, indecision becomes a form of avoidance. I didn't rush toward a choice. I examined it from every angle, the way I'd learned to do with everything else in my life. I laid out the options quietly, without drama, without moral inflation. I could continue as I was. That path was the easiest to explain, the least disruptive. I could keep absorbing, smoothing, compensating. I could use my awareness only to protect myself emotionally, to stop expecting what I wasn't going to receive. Many people live this way. They grow smaller internally to preserve external peace. That option promised stability, but it also promised permanence. I could confront my husband directly. I imagined that conversation many times. I pictured myself explaining how I felt, outlining the patterns I'd noticed, asking for change. In theory, it sounded reasonable. In reality, it depended on something I could no longer assume: his ability to see me differently without being forced to. Confrontation would require him to acknowledge not just my feelings, but the structure that had benefited him. It would require humility, curiosity, and sustained effort, not just once, but over time. And if that conversation failed, or stalled, or softened into good intentions without action, I would have revealed my awareness without securing any change. That was not a risk I was willing to take. The third option was quieter. It didn't involve accusations or ultimatums. It didn't require permission. It required resolve. I could realign the structure. Not dramatically, not destructively, just deliberately. This option meant changing my position without announcing it, adjusting access, responsibility, and dependency in ways that were lawful, ethical, and entirely within my rights. It meant transitioning from assumed support to defined boundaries. It meant acting in a way that could not be undone by apology or reassurance. Irreversible doesn't always mean aggressive. Sometimes it just means final. I spent weeks considering this choice, not because I doubted myself, but because I respected the weight of it. Once set in motion, there would be no returning to the version of me who made everything easy by default. That version had kept the peace, but peace without agency is fragile. What ultimately decided it for me wasn't anger or resentment. It was a single, quiet realization. If I did nothing, I was consenting to be diminished indefinitely. And consent, once given repeatedly, becomes expectation. I didn't want to be rescued. I didn't want to be recognized retroactively. I wanted a life that reflected my actual contribution, not the role others found most convenient. So I chose the path that aligned action with truth. I chose to stop sustaining a structure that required my invisibility. The decision wasn't announced. There was no moment when I marked it on a calendar. It settled into me gradually until it felt inevitable. Once that happened, fear receded. Fear thrives on ambiguity. Clarity dissolves it. I wasn't ending anything yet. I wasn't confronting anyone. I was simply choosing not to preserve an imbalance that depended on my silence. That choice, once made, could not be unmade, because I could never again pretend I didn't see what I saw. Once the decision was made, the work became procedural. That may sound cold, but it was anything but. The procedure gave me distance from emotion. It allowed me to move carefully, deliberately, without tipping the balance too soon. I didn't change everything at once. That would have been noticeable. Instead, I focused on alignment, making sure that responsibility matched authority, that access matched accountability, that my involvement was no longer assumed where it was not formally defined. The first steps were administrative, quiet, entirely reasonable. I updated records that had been left informal for years. I clarified roles that had been understood rather than documented. I ensured that what I managed reflected what I was responsible for, no more, no less. Nothing I did violated trust. It simply removed ambiguity. I scheduled appointments under the guise of routine reviews. I asked questions that any diligent person in my position could ask. I confirmed details that had been taken for granted. No one objected. Why would they? Everything still worked. My husband noticed none of it. He didn't need to. From his perspective, life continued smoothly. That was the point. I wasn't withdrawing support. I was redefining it. I stopped being the default point of continuity for things that didn't belong to me. If something required decision-making authority, I redirected it, politely, professionally. If something fell outside my defined role, I allowed it to remain unresolved until addressed by the appropriate person. This wasn't sabotage. It was boundary enforcement. What surprised me was how much of the system adjusted without friction. Because so much of what I'd been doing had been invisible, its redistribution didn't register as a loss, just as a delay. And delay at first feels like an inconvenience. I was careful to remain calm, helpful, and consistent. I didn't explain myself unnecessarily. Over-explanation invites scrutiny, simplicity deflects it. When asked why something hadn't been handled yet, I responded factually. That needs approval. That falls under a different account now. I'm not listed as the contact for that anymore. Each statement was true. Truth is the safest place to stand. Legally, everything was sound. Financially, everything was transparent. Strategically, everything was timed. I wasn't hiding anything. I was just no longer compensating for gaps that weren't mine to fill. As weeks passed, subtle shifts began to register, though not yet as patterns. A missed follow-up here, a delayed response there. Nothing alarming, nothing urgent. But the system, once seamless, began to show seams. Still, no one traced it back to me. That's the thing about invisible labor. When it stops, the absence is felt, but the source is rarely identified. People assume a glitch, a busy period, a temporary oversight. They don't assume the foundation has moved. And by the time they realize it has, adaptation is no longer optional. I moved quietly, because noise would have turned this into a conflict. And conflict would have forced explanations before the structure was ready to hold them. I didn't want a reaction. I wanted a reconfiguration. So I continued, steady, composed, precise. From the outside, I was still the same Evelyn, calm, reliable, unproblematic. From the inside, I was no longer holding everything together. I was holding myself. The first signs weren't dramatic. They rarely are. They appeared as mild confusion, small enough to dismiss, but persistent enough to irritate. A missed detail here, a follow-up that didn't happen automatically. A question was asked twice because no one was quite sure who was responsible anymore. At first, everyone assumed it was temporary. My husband mentioned being busier than usual. A colleague had dropped the ball. A system needed updating. These explanations floated through conversations without settling on anything concrete. No one said my name. That told me the adjustment was working. The consequences of my withdrawal weren't emotional. They were logistical, structural, the kind that don't provoke anger right away, but create friction over time. Things took longer. Decisions stalled while people waited for information that no longer arrived unprompted. Meetings ended with loose ends. Tasks that had once been completed seamlessly now required follow-up. And follow-up requires awareness. My husband began asking more questions. Not of me, but into the room. He was trying to locate the missing piece without acknowledging its previous location. I listened. I answered when appropriate. I did not fill in the gaps automatically. This wasn't punishment, it was accurate. I had not disappeared. I was simply no longer compensating. The shift unsettled him. Not enough to alarm him, but enough to create tension. He began double-checking things he'd never needed to before. He grew mildly impatient with delays that had once been invisible, and still he didn't connect it to me. That wasn't denial, it was a habit. For years, my work had been absorbed into the environment. Its absence felt like a system issue, not a personal one. At family gatherings, I noticed similar patterns, small oversights, confusion about plans. Someone asks, "Did anyone confirm this?" Followed by a pause. I didn't rush to answer. When I did speak, I was precise, limited, factual. I'm not coordinating that this time. That wasn't brought to me. I assumed someone else was handling it. All true, all calm. The discomfort grew slowly, like pressure rather than shock. People began to feel the cost of assumptions without yet understanding their source. That's when reactions shifted from confusion to frustration. Not directed at me, but at the situation. And frustration left unresolved seeks accountability. My husband grew quieter, more focused, less relaxed. He wasn't angry. He was unsettled. The ground he'd been standing on had softened, and he couldn't see why. I watched him adapt in real time, attempt to regain control by tightening oversight, asking more questions, delegating more explicitly. In other words, doing what I had always done. The difference was that he was new to it. That learning curve was uncomfortable. I felt no satisfaction in this, only confirmation. Confirmation that my labor had been real, that my absence was measurable, that the ease he'd enjoyed had not been inherent to the system, it had been sustained. And now without confrontation, that truth was surfacing. Still, I didn't explain. Explanation would have allowed for temporary fixes, for apologies without restructuring, for promises unanchored by change. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted the consequences to speak for themselves, because when people feel lost without understanding why, they are forced to examine their assumptions. And assumptions, once examined, rarely survive intact. The moment people realize something is wrong is rarely the moment they understand it. At first, the discomfort had felt like friction, annoying, but manageable. By the time it escalated into concern, the system had already shifted too far to be reset quietly. My husband began trying to fix things, not by addressing me directly, but by tightening control elsewhere. He stayed later at work, he scheduled extra meetings, he tried to oversee details that had once flowed smoothly without his involvement. The more he tried to compensate, the more apparent it became that he was compensating for something he didn't fully grasp. He was treating symptoms, not the cause. There's a specific kind of panic that doesn't look like panic at all. It looks like urgency disguised as efficiency, like impatience masked as leadership, like a man working harder while quietly wondering why it no longer worked the way it used to. I watched this without satisfaction, not because I lacked emotion, but because by then, emotion had already done its work. What remained was inevitability. At some point, he began to notice me again, not in the way people imagine. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of past imbalance, just a subtle shift in tone. More questions were directed at me, more pauses, as if waiting for me to step in the way I always had. I didn't. When he asked why something hadn't been handled, I answered honestly. When he implied expectation, I responded with clarity. I wasn't responsible for that. That decision wasn't run by me. I didn't have access anymore. Each response landed heavier than the last, not because of how I said it, but because of what it revealed. I was no longer positioned where he thought I was. That realization unsettled him deeply. He tried to restore normalcy through familiarity, casual gestures, softer language, unspoken assumptions that we would get back to how things were. But how things were depended on my silence. And silence, once chosen deliberately, cannot be reclaimed as habit. There were moments when he seemed almost regretful, not remorseful, regretful, as if he sensed something had been mishandled but couldn't identify exactly when or how. Regret looks backward. Change requires facing forward. By the time he began to sense the scale of the shift, the structure was already aligned to function without my automatic support. Roles had been clarified, dependencies redistributed, boundaries documented. Nothing I'd done could be undone without my cooperation. And I was no longer offering it by default. This is the part of the story where people expect confrontation, a breaking point, a dramatic reckoning. What they don't expect is this. By the time panic arrives, confrontation is unnecessary, because the system itself has already answered the question. He couldn't fix this with effort alone, or charm, or urgency. He couldn't apologize his way back into a dynamic that no longer existed. The version of me who would have accepted that had already stepped aside. What remained was not bitterness, but finality. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt clear. Clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It simply refuses to return to confusion. And by the time he realized that, it was already too late to fix things the old way. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. No raised voices. No accusations, no dramatic pause where everything changed in a single sentence. Just two people sitting across from each other, the air heavy not with anger, but with realization. He initiated it, not because he suddenly understood everything, but because the discomfort had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Systems don't fail loudly at first. They fail by forcing attention. He asked me carefully when things had changed. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was searching for the perfect words, but because I wanted to be precise. Precision matters when you're no longer interested in being misunderstood. I didn't change, I said finally. I stopped compensating. That was all. He looked at me as if he were recalibrating an image he'd been carrying for years. Not angry, not defensive, just off balance. He said he hadn't realized I felt this way. I told him I knew. That surprised him more than anything else. I explained calmly that awareness and intention were not the same thing, that he hadn't needed to mean harm for the structure to harm me. Those patterns form even when no one is trying to create them. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every slight. I didn't need to. By then, the consequences had already demonstrated the truth more effectively than emotion ever could. He asked if there was a way to go back. I shook my head, not out of punishment, out of honesty. You can't unknow something, I said, and neither can I. That was the moment he understood. Not everything, but enough. He saw that this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't an emotional appeal. It wasn't leverage being waived for advantage. It was a boundary that had already been set. We talked for a long time, but not intensely. The tone remained even, measured, almost formal. Not because I was cold, but because heat would have distorted the clarity we'd both reached. He acknowledged his assumptions. Not all of them, not fully, but enough to name them. I acknowledged my silence, my participation in the dynamic, my responsibility for allowing it to continue as long as it did. There was no villain in that room, just consequences. When the conversation ended, nothing felt resolved in the way people expect resolution to feel. There was no relief, no reconciliation, no dramatic closure. But there was alignment. For the first time, my position was understood not as convenience, but as choice. And choices once named change everything. I am often asked whether I feel different now. The honest answer is no, not in the way people expect. I didn't transform into someone louder or sharper or more confrontational. I didn't abandon my nature to prove a point. I am still calm, still observant, still measured. What changed was not my personality, but my position within myself. For a long time, I confused restraint with virtue. I believed that endurance was evidence of strength, that flexibility was a moral good. Those qualities are not inherently harmful, but without boundaries, they become tools others can use without realizing it. Now I understand the difference. I no longer offer my energy as an assumption. I offer it as a decision. That single shift has altered how I move through the world more than any external validation ever could. I am not bitter. Bitterness requires unresolved emotion. What I feel now is clarity, and clarity is surprisingly quiet. I still contribute, I still support, but I do so within structures that acknowledge my agency, where my absence is considered, not taken for granted, where my presence is a choice, not a given. The people around me adjusted, some more easily than others. Systems always resist change at first, then adapt once they realize the change is permanent. My husband, in particular, had to recalibrate his understanding of partnership. Not all of that recalibration was comfortable. Some of it is ongoing. But it is grounded now in reality, not assumption. And that matters. I no longer feel invisible. Not because everyone suddenly sees me, but because I see myself accurately. I know where my influence begins and ends. I know what I'm responsible for and what I am not. That knowledge has made me calmer than I've ever been. There's a quiet confidence that comes from no longer overextending, from no longer filling space to avoid discomfort, from no longer translating your worth into usefulness. I didn't take control by overpowering anyone. I took control by removing my invisibility. That's the part people rarely talk about. Power doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives with a refusal, with precision, with the willingness to let systems feel the weight they've been outsourcing. If there is strength in this story, it's not in what I did, but in what I stopped doing. I stopped making myself small to preserve balance. I stopped equating peace with silence. I stopped waiting to be recognized. I recognized myself, and that recognition changed the way everything else arranged itself around me. There is a version of this story that could have been louder. It could have been framed around blame or triumph, or a single decisive moment where everything broke apart and rebuilt itself overnight. That version might be more satisfying to watch, easier to categorize, easier to cheer for. But it wouldn't be honest. The truth is quieter than that, and more uncomfortable. Most imbalances don't begin with cruelty. They begin with convenience. With one person consistently adapting, smoothing, absorbing, until the system quietly reshapes itself around that effort. Over time, what began as kindness becomes expectation. What began as flexibility becomes an obligation. And what began as silence becomes consent. This story is not a warning against love or partnership or compromise. It's a reminder that none of those things should require erasing yourself. You don't lose your voice all at once. You lose it in increments, each one small enough to justify, each one easy to dismiss, until one day you realize you've been speaking fluently in a language no one else has learned to hear. The turning point isn't rage, it's recognition. Recognition of your position, of your leverage, of the difference between being relied upon and being respected. I didn't reclaim my life by becoming someone else. I did it by becoming accurate about what I contributed, what I tolerated, and what I was willing to continue sustaining. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over your participation. It's the decision to stop cushioning systems that benefit from your silence, to stop offering stability at the cost of self-erasure, to let structures reveal themselves by no longer holding them up invisibly. And here is the part that matters most. You don't need permission to do that. You don't need a villain. You don't need a dramatic reason. You don't need to prove that your discomfort is bad enough. If something requires you to disappear in order to function, it is already asking too much. My story didn't end with applause or revenge. It ended with alignment, with a life that reflects my agency rather than my endurance. And that, I've learned, is a far more lasting kind of justice. If you've listened this far, I want to leave you with one question. Not to answer out loud, but to sit with honestly. Where in your life are you being relied on so consistently that no one has noticed what it would cost them if you stopped? If that question resonates, you're not alone. And if you're willing, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this don't end when the video does.